Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps, and they were singing a new song before the throne, and before the 4 living creatures, and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. In this passage we see that the 144,000 have been raptured or redeemed from the earth and are now in the throne room of heaven. This is confirmed by the presence of the 4 cherubim and the 24 elders. Since we know that the 144,000 were appointed to hide in the wilderness for the 1,260 days of Jacob's trouble, we must now be at the end of that period, which means that we're now transitioning into the very last 2.5 months of history. Remember what Daniel was told. From the time the daily sacrifice is stopped and the sacrilegious object that causes desecration is set up to be worshipped, there will be 1,290 days, and blessed are those who wait and remain until the end of the 1,335 days. So after the 1,260 days of Jacob's trouble, there will be another period of 30 days, and then another period of 45 days beyond that. 2.5 months altogether. We're now transitioning into that period. Do we have any further evidence of a rapture in the transition between those 2 time periods? That is, immediately after Jacob's trouble ends and immediately before the final 2.5 months begins? Well, yes we do. You'll remember that it's immediately after Jacob's trouble ends that the 2 witnesses are resurrected and raptured into heaven. So it seems that the 144,000 will also be part of this very same rapture. And there are others involved in this rapture too, but we'll get to those later. Notice how the 144,000 are raptured as firstfruits for God and the Lamb. Firstfruits is an agricultural term rooted in the Old Testament. To thank God for his provision in early spring each year, the 16th of Nisan on the Jewish calendar, the people of Israel would take the first part of the grain harvest and offer it to him. This event was known as the Feast of Firstfruits. So very simply, the firstfruits came to represent the first part of a much larger harvest. In the New Testament, firstfruits took on a symbolic meaning that meant a sign of what's to come. For example, Paul refers to Epanetus as the firstfruits of the believers in Asia, while the household of Stephanus are referred to as the firstfruits of the believers in Greece. Paul's meaning is that they are the first to convert to Christianity in those regions, but there will be a much larger harvest of souls to come after them. Jesus is also referred to as a type of firstfruits in the New Testament. Paul says, "But in fact Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep." Paul's meaning is that because Jesus has risen from the dead, so will all those who belong to him. He is the sign of what's to come, the first of many. What's especially interesting about Jesus' resurrection is that it actually occurred on the 16th of Nisan, the Jewish feast of firstfruits, and that was a prophetic sign. Because Jesus has been raised, so will all those who believe in him. So the 144,000 being raptured to heaven as firstfruits for God and the Lamb at the 7th trumpet indicates to us that the general resurrection and rapture of every human being who has ever lived is now imminent. The larger harvest is on its way. Now you may remember that I cast doubt on the idea that the church would be raptured back at the 6th seal. And here's why. If this rapture, which is only happening at the 7th trumpet, at the end of Jacob's trouble, is the first fruits rapture, if this is the first fruits rapture right here, then it suggests almost beyond doubt that there have been no other raptures before this point. And if that's the case, the noticeable shift in attention from the church to Israel back at the 6th seal seems more likely to be explained by martyrdom and apostasy of the church than by a rapture. Clearly the church does fade from view back at the sixth seal, but the absence of the church from that point in the narrative doesn't necessarily mean it was raptured. You may remember that Israel fades from view in the book of Acts from chapter 9 onwards, but that didn't mean that Israel ceased to exist after that point. It just meant that God's primary relationship was switching to the church, and God was choosing to tell the narrative through us Gentiles for a time. And because Revelation is like Acts in reverse, in that God will refocus his attention on Israel for the final 7 years of world history and tell the ending of the story through Israel again, we would expect the church to fade from view at that point, but not necessarily because of a rapture, more likely because of the fifth seal martyrdom and apostasy. Indeed, it's striking that when the church began filling up heaven at the sixth seal, they were explicitly described as martyrs in white robes, while in contrast, there is no such mention of martyrdom or white robes for the 144,000. The implication seems to be that the church primarily leaves by martyrdom, but these 144,000 have left by the firstfruits rapture. Must we therefore consider that a worldwide Christian holocaust is going to take place in the future? Is that what will cause so many Christians to turn their backs on Christ, betraying their brothers and sisters in the process by turning them in to the authorities? Or, in the light of all this evidence, can we still make a case for the church being raptured back at the sixth seal? I shall leave that one for you to ponder, but while you do so, read the Olivet Discourse once again. You'll notice that Jesus doesn't mention any raptures until after Jacob's trouble either. Between the firstfruits harvest and the final harvest, God needs to use the intervening 2.5 months to tie off all the loose ends on earth, and part of that means obliterating the Antichrist. His time is up. Returning to Isaiah's prophecy about the Assyrian, we read, "So this is what the Lord of heaven's army says, O my people in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians when they oppress you with rod and club as the Egyptians did long ago. In a little while my anger against you will end, and then my anger will rise up to destroy them. The Lord of heaven's armies will lash them with his whip, as he did when Gideon triumphed over the Midianites at the rock of Oreb, or when the Lord's staff was raised to drown the Egyptian army in the sea." The Antichrist will think that he is destroying Israel by his own satanic power. What he won't understand is that God is only allowing him to trample on Israel to conclude their punishment. The Antichrist's arrogance is unfounded. Ultimately, God will always be in control. God says, "The king of Assyria will not understand that he is my tool. His mind does not work that way. His plan is simply to destroy, to cut down nation after nation." However, now that God's anger against Israel has ended, he's going to turn the tables and destroy the Antichrist and his kingdom. Who is left on earth during those very last 2.5 months? Well, very few believers. Remember how Jesus said, "When the Son of Man returns, how many will he find on the earth who have faith?" Clearly, the inferred answer to his question is, not many. The church is pretty much gone by now, and with the 144,000 raptured, all that's left are the believers who turn to God after seeing the two witnesses being resurrected in Jerusalem at the end of the 1,260 days, those who I referred to earlier as the 11th hour converts. There may be others who responded to the preaching of the gospel by the 144,000 and the two witnesses. We don't know for sure, but the earth at this time will be almost totally devoid of true faith. Not quite, but almost. Almost everyone, the vast majority, will belong to the Antichrist and his evil system. And the few believers who are left, these 11th hour converts, are actually very new, immature believers who have never been discipled. What is more, there's no chance of human discipleship now because the church and the 144,000 are actually gone. With no one to guide them through these very last 2.5 months, they're in a uniquely difficult situation. To compensate for their lack of knowledge and for the general lack of a Christian presence on the earth, God now sends 3 angels to do supernaturally what is no longer possible naturally.